present The Devotees. In the last of our series on literary fan clubs, we examine the continuing cult of Sherlock Holmes and talk to some of the members of this society. But first, the voice of his literary creator.
With regard to Sherlock Holmes, I was, when I wrote it, a young doctor, and had been educated in a very severe and critical medical school of thought, especially coming under the influence of Dr. Bell of Edinburgh, who had most remarkable powers of observation. He prided himself that when he looked at a patient, he could tell not only their disease, but very often their occupation and place of residence.
That was the voice of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, describing how he came to introduce to the world the first and most famous of private detectives.
Reading some detective stories, I was struck by the fact that their results were obtained in nearly every case by chance. I thought I would try my hand at writing a story where the hero would treat crime as Dr. Bell treated disease, and where science would take the place of chance. The result was Sherlock Holmes, and I confess that result has surprised me very much.
He would have been even more surprised if he could see the result today, for Conan Doyle had an imagination unusually compounded of realism and romanticism that brought him a strange, vicarious immortality he did not seek. And in Sherlock Holmes, he created a character who seemed to cross the barrier between fiction and reality.
I learned that many schools of detection, working in France, in Egypt, in China, and elsewhere, have admittedly founded their system upon that of Holmes. To many, he seems to be a real person, and I have had numerous letters from time to time addressed to him from all parts of the world, on the most quaint requests, including what was virtually an offer of marriage. His autograph also is much in demand.
When Sir Arthur died in 1930, an obituarist wrote,
Sherlock Holmes has emerged from his books and assumed a place in the real world. You may go out into the street and ask the first bus conductor you meet, and be assured that he has.
The emergence into reality of Holmes has been confirmed by the many Sherlock Holmes societies which exist all over the world, and which correspond with and even visit each other, for all have their common terms of reference, an assumption that Holmes really lived at 221B Baker Street, sharing rooms with his friend and biographer, Dr. Watson. The idea derives from a literary satire designed to mock the more pretentious types of scholarship, as the president of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, Lord Gorbooth, recalled in a broadcast.
What happened was that as early as 1911, the famous Catholic bishop, who was then Father Knox, wrote a sort of criticism of Conan Doyle's stories about Sherlock Holmes, pointing out there were a number of unanswered questions. Where did Holmes really live? Who was Watson's second wife? And all that sort of thing. This was all republished in the late 1920s, and a number of people got down to writing criticisms of criticisms and corresponding with each other and all the rest. And in 1934, societies were formed in New York and in London for people to get together who were interested in this.
But the purely satirical motive of Monsignor Ronald Knox, as he became, was largely forgotten in the many books and articles on Holmes which appeared over the years, and the discussions arising from them. The problems examined, which seem to be innumerable, derive from the inconsistencies and loose ends in the stories. For Conan Doyle, whose historical novels, meticulously researched, have aroused little interest in scholars, regarded Sherlock Holmes as a lightweight, and did not bother to check the details in one story with those in another, as his daughter, Dame Jean Conan Doyle, recalls.
Oh, that's so true. Because my father always took the line that he wasn't really interested in detail. He was interested in spinning a good yarn. And as long as the story stood up and was a good, exciting story, he didn't mind about detail. He wrote his stories very quickly.
But in the Sherlock Holmes stories, he created a whole world peopled by characters who, in addition to the two principals, have become enshrined in English folklore. The landlady, Mrs. Hudson, the arch-villain and Napoleon of crime, Professor Moriarty, Sherlock's brother, Mycroft, who at times was the British government, the Scotland Yard detective, Inspector Lestrade, and the adventuress, Irene Adler.
To Sherlock Holmes, she was always the woman.
I have been beaten 4 times, 3 times by men, and once by a woman.
It was not that he felt any emotion akin to love for Irene Adler. All emotions, and that one particularly, were abhorrent to his cold, precise, but admirably balanced mind. He never spoke of the softer passions save with a jibe or a sneer.
Sir Holmes's remark when Watson became engaged to Mary Morstan, heroine of The Sign of 4, was predictably churlish.
I really cannot congratulate you.
If Watson, who claimed experience of women over 3 continents, was over-susceptible, Holmes was certainly over-skeptical. His austere image was emphasized by Sidney Paget's illustrations to the short stories in the Strand magazine. Lean, long-nosed, and lantern-jawed, and when outdoors, wearing a deer-stalker's hat, a garment which Paget himself affected. The curved pipe was added by the American illustrator Frederick Dorr Steele, and these 2 adjuncts, never mentioned in the stories, now feature in every portrayal of Holmes, and are woven into the tie worn by members of the Sherlock Holmes Society. The stories in the Strand were so popular that queues stood at bookstalls for the latest number. But Doyle tired of Holmes and wrote to his mother that he intended to kill him off.
I am in the middle of the last Holmes story, after which the gentleman vanishes, never to reappear.
So, in The Final Problem, published in the Strand for December 1893, Holmes encountered Professor Moriarty, pursued him to Switzerland, where Conan Doyle had recently spent a holiday, and disappeared with him over the Reichenbach Falls.
An examination by experts leaves little doubt that a personal contest between the 2 men ended in their reeling over, locked in each other's arms. Any attempt at recovering the bodies was absolutely hopeless. And there, deep down in that dreadful cauldron of swirling water and seething foam, will lie for all time the most dangerous criminal and the foremost champion of the law of their generation.
The effect on the reading public was devastating. In London, young men in thousands went to their offices in black ties and armbands. Abuse and threats reached the author. Murderer was one of the milder epithets used. Perhaps it was with a sense of caution that Doyle did not allow anyone to see the body. In August 1901 appeared The Hound of the Baskervilles, set in a period before Holmes's death. In the same year, a play entitled simply Sherlock Holmes was performed in London with an American actor, William Gillette, as Holmes, and a youth named Charles Chaplin as Billy the page boy. Gillette and Doyle exchanged telegrams.
May I marry Holmes?
Marry him or murder him, or do what you like with him.
But if Doyle intended thus to wash his hands of Holmes, he was later persuaded by public demand and publishers' offers to change his mind. In The Empty House, published in the Strand for October 1903, he brought him back to life. But frustrated in his intentions towards Holmes, Doyle summarily disposed of Mrs. Watson.
In some manner, Holmes had learned of my sad bereavement, and his sympathy was shown in his manner rather than his words.
Work is the best antidote to sorrow, my dear Watson, and I have a piece of work for us both tonight.
And so the pair set out again on a series of adventures as popular with the public as ever. Although a Cornish boatman said to the author,
I think, sir, when Holmes fell over that cliff, he may not have killed himself, but all the same, he was never quite the same man again.
but Sherlock's place in the world of reality grew firmer with the years. The stories were translated into nearly every language, and the flow of letters increased, mostly addressed to the detective at 221B Baker Street, but delivered to the author, who tried to help the writers, if he could, by using Holmesian methods. When Dr. Watson announced that Holmes had retired in 1903 to keep bees on the Sussex Downs, numerous ladies wrote offering to be his housekeeper. Both Holmes and Watson were now familiar figures in the Conan Doyle family circle.
I think that he always had an amused affection for him. In fact, we all grew up with an amused affection for Sherlock Holmes and also for dear Dr. Watson.
And when, in 1959, the centenary of the author's birth was celebrated at a dinner of the Sherlock Holmes Society, Dame Jean Conan Doyle spoke as guest of honor.
I wanted to show that we all had this great affection in the family for Holmes. I wanted to get across the idea that Holmes was one of his favorite characters. So often one sees his reference to his resentment against Holmes, but it wasn't bad. I grew up feeling that Holmes gave him a great deal of amusement.
Sherlock Holmes stories continued to appear at intervals in the Strand magazine and subsequent book form until 1927. Then, without actually killing him, Conan Doyle firmly and finally disposed of his hero.
He must go the way of all flesh, real or imaginary. And so, reader, farewell to Sherlock Holmes.
The first Sherlock Holmes Society was dissolved with the approach of war. But in America, there remained the New York Society called the Baker Street Irregulars, after the band of street urchins occasionally employed by Holmes to gain information, introduced in the first story, A Study in Scarlet.
It is the Baker Street division of the detective police force. There's more work to be got out of one of those little beggars than out of a dozen of the force. The mere sight of an official-looking person seals men's lips. These youngsters, however, go everywhere and see everything.
Both Presidents Roosevelt and Truman joined the Baker Street Irregulars. After the war, the government planned a Festival of Britain to be held in 1951. Author and journalist James Holroyd had an idea.
One afternoon, I called in the Marylebone Reference Library to see what they might have about Holmes, who, after all, was one of their parishioners, lived round the corner in Baker Street. And in conversation with the deputy reference librarian, I suggested to him that the Marylebone Council might do worse than put on a Sherlock Holmes exhibition as their contribution to festival year. Well, this casual suggestion of mine was taken up by the Marylebone Libraries Committee and put to the council, and there was a debate.
The council rejected the idea, but Holroyd found he had started something.
Very soon after the debate, a letter appeared in the Times correspondence columns from Dr. Watson, who had come out of retirement to hope that second thoughts might prevail and that St. Marylebone might, after all, decide to have an exhibition devoted to Holmes.
Other letters followed from Mycroft Holmes, Inspector Lestrade, Mrs. Hudson, and other characters from the canon, all apparently alive and well, having survived 3 wars and the intervening events.
I'm sure that those letters had a very decisive effect in persuading Marylebone that there would be a great deal of, not merely of local interest, but of national interest in the project, and it went forward.
The exhibition was held at the new Abbey National Building Society headquarters in Baker Street. The main attraction was a reproduction of Holmes and Watson's sitting room in Baker Street, where most of the adventures start and finish. Holmes's pipe and violin, the Persian slipper in the fireplace where he kept his tobacco, and coal scuttle in which he kept his cigars. His correspondence, pierced to the mantelpiece with a jackknife. And the initials V.R., perforated on the wall in an idle moment by Holmes's revolver, though it was not explained why the long-suffering Mrs. Hudson had not insisted on repairs at her lodger's expense. But had the organizers been so carried away that they forgot the originator?
I was a bit worried one time about the exhibition because, of course, it was produced on the to give the assumption that Holmes and Watson had actually lived in Baker Street. And, of course, this is a great in-joke, and it's perfectly splendid. But there are a great many members of the public who really believed that Holmes and Watson did live. And I felt it was wrong to give this wrong impression that one should indicate that they were characters created by my father, and the fact that his name was omitted completely from the catalogue worried me. Anyhow, I'm glad to say that when it appeared, carried a note which made it quite clear that my father had created these two characters.
During the run of the exhibition, which was seen by over 50,000 people, including Queen Mary, a few helpers got together to see whether there should be a Sherlock Holmes Society. There was a Sherlock Holmes Society established in London in 1934. It met just once a year for a dinner on Derby night, and the new society was fortunate in having at least four of the earlier societies. And at the first full meeting, we were again extremely fortunate in securing Sir Sidney Roberts, or S.C. Roberts as he then was, to be the first president. He continued as president until his death, and was succeeded by our present president, Lord Godbout.
We have meetings about 4 or 5 times a year to either listen to a paper or have a discussion or see a film on some aspect of the Holmes stories. We do have an expedition in the summer sometimes, and of course there was that very famous one, which was highly televised, to Switzerland in 1968, when Professor Moriarty and Sherlock Holmes, whom I impersonated on that day, fought it out again with the Reichenbach Falls booming away in the background.
Even Conan Doyle might have enjoyed it.
Oh, I think he'd have got a lot of enjoyment out of that. You remember the occasion when he once dressed up as Professor Challenger and was photographed for the frontispiece of one of his books as Challenger. This always appealed to him.
Would he have been equally amused by the other activities of the Sherlockian devotees?
The Sherlock Holmes Society, he would have had a great affection for amusement. He had a great sense of fun, and a deadpan sense of fun on occasions, and I think he would have thoroughly enjoyed the in-joke of the Holmes Society, and the fact that such very erudite people get pleasure out of it. And I think if he hadn't been the creator of Holmes, he would have been a very enthusiastic member of the Sherlock Holmes Society.
In fact, when Ronald Knox's essay in the literature of Sherlock Holmes first appeared in 1911, Conan Doyle wrote to him.
I cannot help writing to tell you of the amusement and also the amazement with which I read your article on Sherlock Holmes. That anyone should spend such pains on such material was what surprised me. Certainly you know a great deal more about it than I do.
Doyle continued to discuss Ronald Knox's criticisms in detail. So he was, in fact, one of the first Sherlockian researchers. He did, however, rebuke one of the critics who identified him with Holmes.
Have you not learned, my esteemed commentator, that the created is not the creator? So please get this fact in your cerebral tentacle. The doll and its maker are never identical.
With such facility for writing light verse, he would certainly have appreciated the winning Clerihew in a competition organized by the Sherlock Holmes Journal.
Professor Moriarty was a law-breaking old party, but he did obey the law of gravity in the Reichenbach cavity.
Though he might have been a bit dubious about the American Science Society, the Brothers Three of Moriarty, New Mexico, who meet annually in their frontier bar to chant their birthday anthem to Professor Moriarty.
Unhappy birthday to you, unhappy birthday to you, unhappy birthday, you bastard, unhappy birthday to you.
Other American science societies, of which there are many, usually based on individual Holmes stories, include The Creeping Men of Cleveland, The Greek Interpreters of Michigan, The Noble Bachelor and Concubines of St. Louis, The Newly Formed Neglected Patients of Dr. Watson, and perhaps most remarkable, The Solitary Cyclist of Washington, which can always only have one member, the president perhaps? There are, however, the Solitary Cyclists of Sweden among the European societies. London had its Science Society, the Milvertonians of Hampstead, for that trendy suburb was once the home of the worst man in London, the blackmailer Charles Augustus Milverton.
Do you feel a creeping, shrinking sensation, Watson, when you stand before the serpents in the zoo and see the slithery, gliding, venomous creatures with their deadly eyes and wicked, flattened faces? That's how Milverton impresses me.
Meetings of the Sherlock Holmes Society have discussed varying aspects of the stories, such as Sherlock Holmes and wine, Sherlock Holmes and sport, the railway journeys of Sherlock Holmes. An example of the kind of problem discussed by Sherlockians is the question of Dr. Watson's marriage or marriages. In one of the 3 stories narrated by Holmes, he said that Watson had deserted him for a wife.
A lot of people have presumed from that Watson had deserted Holmes because he'd married again. But I say he hadn't married again until he'd gone off for a naughty weekend with somebody else's wife. That Mary Morstan was the only wife that he ever had. And that she was a very understanding wife. They had a modern marriage. They'd been married for a long time. And the only other evidence is when in the empty house, when Holmes comes back from Tibet, Watson says something about his bereavement. Well, Mary and he may have lost a son or something. Or she may have lost her grandmother, or God knows what.
The 6th Marquis of Donegal, who edited the Sherlock Holmes journal for more than 20 years, appeared to have overlooked the fact that shortly after Holmes's return, Watson sold his practice and returned to Baker Street, which he could hardly have done if he still had a wife. Letters still come in from all over the world, addressed to the detective at 221B Baker Street, delivered now to the Abbey National Headquarters. The reproduction of the Baker Street sitting room, used in the 1951 exhibition, is preserved in the dining room of the Sherlock Holmes public house in Northumberland Avenue. And today, Holmes and Watson are accepted as national monuments, constantly referred to in advertisements, articles, speeches, and broadcast programs. Some quotations from the stories have become widely known and are used as common conversational coin by Sherlockians.
You know my methods, Watson. Apply them.
He walked up to the sideboard and, tearing a piece from the loaf, devoured it voraciously. "You are hungry," I remarked.
When you have eliminated the impossible, what remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Holmes had spent several days in bed, as was his habit from time to time.
Everything comes in circles. The old wheel turns and the same spoke comes up. It has all been done before, and will be again.
But Holmes never said, "Elementary, my dear Watson," a phrase included in some of the stage and film versions that have appeared over the years. Every year sees more and more books of scholarship published, including at least 6 chronologies, which disagree with each other about the dates of the stories, but all agree that in most cases Dr. Watson got it wrong.
He didn't know the date of his own marriage. Well, that's quite possible. Some people are very sort of absent-minded, you know. It's very important because all the dating of the stories depends on the date of Watson's marriage. Yes. And all the most learned professors in the world have been arguing about the date of Watson's marriage ever since.
The works of scholarship respect the authenticity of the original, but a recent tendency is to invent plots using Holmes and Watson as characters. Would the author have objected to this?
When they manipulate the characters in such a way that he would have been quite horrified, I think he would have been full of wrath, contemptuous wrath. I mean the sort of recent occasions when Holmes has been shown to be so weak-willed that drug addiction took the master hand. It's quite out of character. Holmes would never have been as weak-willed as all that. He always had drugs or anything else under his control. They didn't control him. And I haven't seen it myself, but I hear that there was a television program recently in which Watson was in and out of bed with one of the housemaids. Well, this is completely out of character. And it's also so alien to anything that my father would have written about Watson.
Perhaps more acceptable is the practice indulged in by the author's son Adrian, among others, of trying to write the untold stories at which Watson hints throughout the canon, and some of which, he tells us, are deposited in the vaults of the Bank of Cox and Company at Charing Cross. The mystery of Mr. James Phillimore, who, stepping back into his own house to fetch his umbrella, was never more seen in this world. The sudden death of Cardinal Tosca, when Holmes was summoned by the Pope. The singular affair of Ricoletti of the Clubfoot and his abominable wife, and the dreadful business of the Abernethy family, which was first brought to Holmes's attention by the depth to which the parsley had sunk into the butter on a hot day. Most members of the Sherlock Holmes Society agree that they first came to the stories at an early age, and applications for membership come in from young people of both sexes.
But what amazes me about it is that you'd think you'd exhaust the subject by 1975, but not at all. We in the Sherlock Holmes Society get more and more young members, which is a fact. And we've got over 500 members now. I don't know what fascinates them about it. I think it's the Victorian ensemble and a general setup. You know, I think handsome cabs and fogs and things fascinate them, and queens giving away emerald rings and offering knighthoods, and, you know, that sort of thing. They think it's a good game, and indeed everybody from teenagers now to Oxford professors still think it's a good game.
Perhaps Conan Doyle got nearer to the heart of his mystery than many learned commentators in his preface to The Lost World.
I have wrought my simple plan. If I give 1 hour of joy to the boy who's half a man, or the man who's half a boy.
Though today he might have to find an extra rhyme for girls. For millions of readers, then, Holmes and Watson live on the two borderlines, between childhood and adulthood, and between fiction and reality. And in a late Victorian setting, which recalls an age both wilder and safer, where the most dangerous expeditions end in a cozy chat round the Baker Street fireplace. And the man who created them was honored at the centenary of his birth by the rare accolade of a Times leader.
The only sensible comment to be made about Sherlock Holmes is that he must be an immortal, because if he were not, we should have got sick of him through overpraise. Conan Doyle would wish to be remembered for more than this, but it is as a storyteller that he first comes to mind. As a storyteller, he was a giant, and that means that he was a great artist. And it is good storytelling that we all, young and old, high, low, and middlebrow, want when we can get it, and get it too seldom. That is surely the secret of the survival of Conan Doyle.
And, of course, of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson.
The Baker Street Regulars was written by Lionel W. Bailey and narrated by Anthony Jacobs, with the voices of Stephen Thorne, Wilfred Carter, Michael Shannon, and Geoffrey Siegel. The program was produced by Maurice Leach.